Hello everybody, it's Kathy Gonzalez from Milestone Maths, and I'm here today to talk to you about teaching reading and spelling to kids and just about anybody. Now, you're probably wondering why it is that somebody who is writing a textbook series for maths would be talking about reading and spelling. Well, I'm also a special needs literacy tutor, one who's managed to get the unteachable to read, and I often get asked to present and to talk about this subject. So I thought I'd make it available to everybody, easily and downloadable. Okay, so before I get into what it is that I do and how I do it, and how you can do it at home, but practically for free, I want to dispel a few reading and spelling myths. There's quite a few myths that have become like folklore amongst the teaching community, and they've gotten absorbed into some homeschooling circles. And I'd just like to talk to some of those and try and explain, what we can do with this. Okay, the first myth is that kids can teach themselves to read. Now, for all the homeschoolers who've got children who fall into this category, you're extremely blessed. It's not the case for everybody. And in a moment, you'll see how few there actually are that fit into this category. Basically, the teachers for a long time have said that there are kids who will learn how to read and some who will never learn how to read. It's a bit like there'll be kids who can learn how to sing and some who can never sing. Actually, you can teach a lot more people to sing than can naturally sing. And in the case of reading, you can teach a whole lot more people than can naturally read. And I think it's just unfair on those who could learn to read, but are considered, impossible to teach, or it's inappropriate to teach them because of this faulty myth. Another one that I hear quite a lot is the notion that there can be too much phonics. Again, this tends to come from teachers, and I think that the main source of that is some programs that actually overcomplicate things and often aren't true phonics to begin with anyway. The Orton-Gillingham methods, there's a bunch of programs that profess to be based on the Orton-Gillingham method. They're all very similar in nature when you look at the very core of them. They tend to overcomplicate the process, and there's usually a very big learning curve for both the teacher and the student. There are a few where there's some excellent teacher materials and some open and go kind of stuff. That's good on the teacher, but I still find that the underlying principle and method behind it tends to be a bit much on young children and children who have difficulty learning to read. There are a few for whom it does work well, and they're mostly ones who need a lot of rigid structure and rules. By and large, though, tends to be a bit of a waste of time at the least, and at the worst, it can be just confusing for your kids. Another myth that has been largely dispelled now, but you still hear it every now and then, that there are some words that you cannot teach phonetically, things that aren't spelled what we would say regularly. And I would maintain, and it has become the understanding in science of reading, that just about every single word in the English language has at least some element that you can say, point to and say, well, that letter says the sound you expect it to say. English has got a lot of complicated spellings, so that does make the job a little bit more difficult, and there are some words where it can be difficult to see why a particular letter is used to spell a particular sound. Often if you analyse it closely enough, you'll find it. But even so, if you teach the child to spell words rather than read them, you'll overcome this problem. Another myth that relates to spelling is that kids will just naturally pick up spelling through their reading. Now, this will work for the kids who are particularly observant and have got a good memory for the different spelling patterns and are able to spot patterns easily. It won't work for all of them. And you can have some really, really good readers who are able to recognize a word but will not be able to write the word. And that's just because we have such a complicated English spelling system, which we'll get to in a moment. Now, here's a bit of more detail on that first myth, that some children will naturally teach themselves to read. Well, you know, the teachers who tend to say this will say, well, the kids who can learn to read will just learn and the others won't. The real numbers, as found through a study, are that 5% of children will learn with little or no phonics instruction at all. And many of those kids will actually learn to read all by themselves. These children have a very high degree of what we call phonemic awareness that comes almost naturally to them. Just like some people have perfect pitch almost naturally. They recognize notes just when they hear one. They might hear the ding on the microwave and be able to tell you that it's like a B flat or something. The same thing happens with phonemic awareness. The child is very attuned to, so you say the word cat, it actually hears cat. And these children will teach themselves to read. Usually it's girls. You'll find they'll be learning to read as young as 3. And some of them will appear to have learnt themselves. If you have one of these children who are in the top 5%, you are extremely lucky and your job is basically done for you. The next 35% of children will learn how to read with a little bit of phonetic instruction. So these are the children who learnt to read once they discarded the pure whole language model and went to what was called balanced literacy, where a little bit of phonics was introduced. Sometimes at the beginning, often after they've been introduced to some whole language and sight words. And those kids managed to muddle through and learn how to read quite well. Often they didn't learn how to spell, and here's the whole you can be a good reader without being a good speller thing coming back again. But they just did learn to read fairly easily. And this 40% of the class is the 40% the teacher says can teach themselves to read. I don't think the teachers have ever really run the numbers on this, because they wouldn't say that it was so easy to teach a child to read if they really sat down and noticed that, you know, more than half the class didn't actually read that well. The next 45% need some support, and they need explicit, systematic, synthetic phonics. They need to be taught to make words from the sounds. So at makes cat, but at makes bat. This needs to be drilled, and they need to spend a lot of time reading and spelling individual words. And when they do this, they will learn to read, and they will learn to read very well. The other two groups that we've spoken about aren't harmed by this instruction, although it may get a bit boring for them if you keep the repetition up in their levels. And this is where you have to differentiate. In a homeschool environment, you're lucky you don't have to worry about that so much. All this means is you have to adjust the pace that you're presenting the material based on your child, and you've got to look for the cues. So the last 15% of our class are the children who display symptoms of dyslexia, and they are the ones that are difficult to teach. Almost all of them will learn, and I haven't yet to meet one who's been a complete failure on this. They will learn if they're given exactly the same as the 35% before the needed or 45% before the needed. If they're given explicit, synthetic, systematic phonics. The chief difference is that they need a lot more of it. So whereas you may have had to repeat it 20 times for the previous group, with these children you may need to repeat the same thing 1,000 times over. It sounds daunting, it sounds like a massive task. It just means you need to embed games and fun ways to do that, but you will get through it. Now, a good reader is not necessarily a good speller, and I think I've already touched on this. but it just is the case for the English language that it's easy to recognise words, much easier to recognise them than it is necessarily to remember how to spell them, because we have multiple ways to spell the same sound often. However, if you know how to spell, and you know how to spell well, it is impossible to not know how to read, because once you can spell a word, you will recognise it on sight and you will be able to read it. The only thing that may vary between kids at this point is their fluency, and this just comes down to how much practice they've had with actual reading. And that's up to you to make sure that the child gets the practice they need to build their fluency. Now, this is true for the English language particularly, and that's because the English language is one of the most complicated languages in terms of the spelling for the sounds, and we'll go into why right now. We have between 40 to 45 different speech sounds in the English language. The range is because it depends on where you come from in your accent, and also depends on which linguist or speech therapist you ask. There's some arguments over some particular sounds. But basically the number always falls in that range, between 40 and 45 sounds. You know, we only have 26 letters in the alphabet, so trying to spell 40 odd sounds with 26 letters means that we're going to have to come up with some creative spellings. And the most logical ones are the digraphs where we have SH says sh, CH says ch, things like that. The problem is they didn't come up with one spelling for one sound. So the spelling for the word A, for the sound A, it could be the letter A at the end of a syllable. It could be the vowel digraph AY at the end of a word. It could be AI in the middle of the word. It may be what I call the split digraph, A consonant E, like in ale. There's a lot of different sound spellings. It could even be EIGH as in 8. When you boil it all down and you look at all the different spellings for the different sounds, you'll find that there's somewhere between 70 to 80 different ways to spell those 40 odd sounds. So that's what makes the spelling such a problem. However, for nearly 2,000 years, no one taught their kids to read. In ancient Greece, about 2,000 years ago, just around the turn of the millennium, they had invented the vowels. And once they invented the vowels, they come up with a very clever little invention known as a syllable table. And this syllable table was the basis of all spelling instruction for literally 2,000 years all over Europe. And children didn't need to be taught to read because they were taught to spell first. And once they were taught to spell, as soon as their vocabulary, the spelling became big enough, they would just start reading. And that was the case for the 2,000 years until the 18th century, when a couple of French monks decided to change things. And one of them in particular was teaching deaf children to read, and he thought, well, what use have they got the sounds? They can't hear them. And it sounded logical to him that, well, instead of using sounds, let's use pictures. Let's put a picture of a cat and write the word CAT under it, or have less spell in French. And voila, we have a new reading method. And the problem with that was that the child was now taught to treat the word as a single unit, like a picture. In fact, in one of these gentlemen's books, it literally states that the teacher should not bring attention of the child to any letter in the word. The separation of letters shouldn't even be obvious to the child. And that came across in America. They introduced this program in the 1800s, and that same instruction was in those same books. It didn't take very long in the US for a lot of the public to realise that this was completely faulty and did not work. And there was a massive outcry. And from that day forward, we had balanced literacy approaches. Because English has got its spelling anomalies, and the French is almost as bad as English on this account. Some clever teachers thought, well, yeah, it's not a good idea to try and teach all of English as pictograms, because that just puts a massive load on the child's memory, and we have the evidence of Chinese and Egyptian that it actually takes a sage to be able to read in such a system. So let's just treat the tricky spelling words, our sight words, the top 100 words that appear in everything but are always spelt funny. Let's treat them as the hieroglyphs that make everything else phonetic. Now, the problem with that is it sets up cognitive dissonance in the child's brain, and this has caused so much illiteracy in the world. It's not funny. And a lot of dyslexics are actually just confused kids whose brains have been scrambled by this tension between the whole language, let's look at this word as a picture, and true phonetics. So, if the phonetic spelling method worked for 2,000 years, why change things? Well, it was politics and money. We won't go there. Now, the big thing, I've told you that every child can be taught using the spelling book method to read. Every single one of those children on the graph can be taught. The thing that just differentiates the top 5% who can basically teach themselves from the bottom 15% who need very special and explicit instruction is how much instruction and how fast you go. So it all comes down to pacing. And Anna Gillingham, who was the author of the original Orton-Gillingham program, has been quoted as saying, go as fast as you can, but as slow as you must. So basically, you need to watch for your child, and you need to repeat as much as the child needs to understand the current concept, to be able to spell the words that you're trying to teach them to spell. Basically, spelling tests should be a 100% mastery thing. So you should keep going with the one spelling list until your child can spell everything in that list. And then you can move forward. How big that spelling list is depends on how old your kid is and their patience. So we're going to go through a very simple teaching sequence now, and I'll explain roughly how I teach kids to read and spell. Now, basically, you just need some spelling list. We are teaching them to spell, and then they're going to learn how to read. How you're going to encourage reading along the side of this is, as they have a vocabulary that's big enough, you can start teaching them, dictating them sentences to write, and then have them compose their own sentences. And from there, they will kind of naturally springboard into reading for themselves, and you will find that they start reading almost on their own. Okay, so the first thing that was taught with the old syllable book, syllable table spelling book method, was short syllables, 2-letter syllables, where we have a vowel followed by a letter. And the two examples that I have up there on the screen are ab and eb. The child, when they're first learning, might go ab, eb, perfectly fine. And you can make every combination that you can with the vowels and consonants and have the child read through them. And you can make up flashcards, you can play games with this, you can pretend they're words, and just have your kid learn to read those and spell them. Important that they learn to spell them. So you might use letter tiles, you might have the kid write with chalk on chalkboard, whiteboard marker on a whiteboard, with a stick in the sand, with their finger in a tray of flour or cornmeal or whatever you want to put down there. Whatever works for you. And for the age of your child, I wouldn't get very young children. If your child is sort of wanting to learn how to read or wanting to learn early, I wouldn't have them using a pencil and paper when they're too young. Probably not below the age of about 6. I would not expect the child to be able to write very well. Their hands just aren't really developed for that. Okay, once we've gone through all the short vowel syllables, we then move on to short vowel words. So single syllable words like cat, spat, went, plant. These include the different combinations of consonants. We've got consonant blends in there. I don't make a big deal of consonant blends. Children who are taught to spell and to sound out words well won't generally have a problem with the consonant blends. There are a few who will need specific instruction with that, but usually after you've taught them 2 or 3, they will start hearing it themselves and being able to do it themselves. Once you've gone through the single syllables, you can introduce, and it's a good idea, and some of the really good old spelling books would do this, you can introduce simple 2-syllable words that are made up. And particularly you could start with compound words like bobcat, where you've actually got 2 separate words, you can join it together and make a word, and you can introduce rabbit and very simple 2-syllable words that follow the same pattern. And that actually gets their reading vocabulary skyrocketing really quickly when you do that. It will make it a bit harder on the spelling because then you've got to worry about when there's a double B and a single B. But again, if they're just taught as spelling words and the child gets taught that we have this funny, sometimes we use a double letter here and sometimes a single letter. There are some principles as to when that happens and why. In the base words, it's really hard to find that. When we're adding suffixes, the rules are a bit more consistent. So I wouldn't go to town trying to find a rule for that. Just have the kid learn individual words. Once we've got through all those, we can then move on to the consonant diagram. So sh, with PH. And after that, we can then introduce long vowels. And this is going to be where the child learns for the first time that a letter can make more than one sound. And one way to do this is the way they used to do it in the spelling book, and introduce the long vowel syllable for words first. Words that end with a vowel, syllables that end with a vowel usually have a long sound on that vowel, especially if it's a stressed syllable in a word. So the syllables we see here would be pronounced li, be, by, they, bo, you. And you can do this as a transition from the short vowel to the long vowels. You can leave this out and just go straight to long vowel words. That one's up to you. I would teach the split, what I call the split phonograms, as individual sounds to the child before making words that use that spelling. So A consonant E, B consonant E, all of those. I would teach them as a sound, just like you taught the letters to have an individual sound. And that makes it easier for the spelling exercise that comes next, which is the long vowel words that are spelled with a vowel consonant E. Okay, so after teaching the simple VCE words, now some programs and some people call this bossy E words. I prefer just to call that a special spelling. It's just more consistent with the spelling book approach. After you've done that, we can then go to vowel polygraphs. And so we've got the spellings like A, Y, and A-I say A, O-A, O-E say O, all the way up to things like I-G-H and O-U-G-H. We introduce them slowly and systematically, and one after the other, and from the most common to the least common, and also then from the simplest to the most complicated. This is where you need a very well organized spelling list, and we'll get to those in a moment. Every time you teach a polygraph vowel spellings, so AI or AY, you would then go and teach words that use that spelling, and this is where a very well organized list will be your friend. Now, where do we find those very well organized lists? Well, there are a number of resources that are free. Some of them are quite old, but there's also some new resources available. The classic resource for this is Noah Webster's spelling book. Noah Webster actually wrote the dictionary in the US. The Webster's dictionary is named after him because he did do You can find copies of Noah Webster's spelling book on Google Books and on Internet Archive. But if you go to donpotter.net, donpotter.net, and look up his education pages, you will find 3 or 4 editions of Noah Webster's spelling book that have been typed out by hand, and so they're a clean, nice, easy file to read on your device or to print out if that's what you want. My favourite edition is the 1824. I think it's the best balance between the really old-fashioned spelling book and a modern reader. It does leave off reading until a bit later, so there aren't any sentences until the child can actually read and spell quite a big vocabulary. I find that better than some of the later editions where there's reading produced right up front. That can cause some problems for some kids, but you can still use those books if you like them. Sam Blumenfeld's Alpha Phonics was written in the 1950s, I believe, maybe 60s, by Samuel Blumenfeld. He was an editor who discovered that reading was being not taught very well in America, and he decided to do something about it, and he wrote the book Alpha Phonics. Since his death, that's been freely available. He donated all of his materials to an organisation of a national sort of libertarian organisation in the US. You will have to sign up to their mailing list to gain access, but once you've downloaded what you want, just unsubscribe from their list. If you just do a search for Samuel Blumenfeld's Alpha Phonics, you will find that, and we can put a link in the description. The final one is Phonics International. Now, I don't know that the lady who put Phonics International together ever heard of a spelling book, unlike Sam Blumenfeld, but she has actually produced something that looks very much like the old-fashioned spelling book. And if you go to her website, again, you have to join her website to be able to gain access. That's purely a requirement for her to get funding. She's being funded to put that website up, which makes it free for us. I've never actually received any emails from her, so I don't think you're joining a mailing list at all. Once you get in, you need to look for, under each level, she has 12 levels to her program, the book called the Sounds Book. And the Sounds Book, every page in the Sounds Book has a spelling at the top of the page that you're concentrating on, and then a list of words that the child can spell that contain that spelling and no other sounds that they have not already learned how to spell. And this is perfect for this method of teaching reading. The one advantage for some people, disadvantage for others, is that she doesn't concentrate on rhyming words. Rhyming words, which we used a lot in Noah Webster's book for ease, and Sam Blumenfeld's book as well, can cause a child to get lazy, and it can mean that it takes them a bit longer to actually pick up reading fluently than they otherwise would if you mix things up a bit. That's what the Phonics International lady does. Now, I've recently discovered a paid program that was written right here in Australia. It's called Soundwaves Literacy, and I think it's probably one of the best modern day phonics programs I've ever seen. It basically is based on the idea of the old spelling book idea, along with a modern, bright, colourful workbook for kids. So if you want a workbook to have as well on your journey, then this is a really good one to go for. The actual workbooks are pretty affordable. The teacher resources, which are excellent, I've seen them, and the samples, they're absolutely spot on in terms of teaching phonics. They are geared for a classroom, but they would work just as well on a tablet or a phone with you sitting next to your child. And there's a lot of instruction for you personally on how to deliver the lessons. I think they're very well done. You don't really need them. They are a bit expensive. If you just follow the basic idea of reading and learning how to spell all the words as the lists show up, and you pace to your child, not according to what the workbook says. So the workbooks look like you do a double page spread per week. I would stick to a double page spread until the child can spell all the words in the list. The words in sound waves are generally organised so that we have the easy words in the list first and the harder words towards the end of the list. If you're teaching a very young child who's very keen, you might relax the spelling requirement on the harder words in the list and revisit in 6 to 12 months' time, go back through the book. So go through the book as quickly as you can, and you may get through it in 6 months and go back through again for spelling. But otherwise, it's a rock solid spelling book method of instruction that I would fully endorse. So I've given you a few hints on activities as I've gone through. I'll just go through a kind of a systematic way of teaching the spelling using one of these resources. First of all, you're going to choose a list of words that you're working on for the week, or for maybe for a couple of days. It depends on how quickly your child picks up and how many words you've chosen. You would have the child read through the list of words. You would have them, now if you've introduced a new sound, you would show them how that sound is spelled. If we're learning handwriting, they're old enough to learn handwriting, you're going to teach them how to write that particular letter or combination of letters together. Here's one point I could introduce here right now. If for some children, cursive is the difference between being able to learn to read and not. If your child is having trouble picking up reading, it may pay for you to try and teach them how to write in cursive, as well as trying to teach them to spell. Sometimes that is the key that unlocks what would otherwise be a brain that just won't learn to read or spell. So we read through the words and we learn to spell them, whether we write them by hand or use letter tiles or whatever device you're using to teach your child how to spell. And then you do that at least once a day, reading through the list. Again, when you move on, depends on when the child is able to spell all the words. And generally, you want to try and stick to 5-minute sessions, no more than 15-minute sessions for older children. So you pick as many words as you can get through in that 5 to 15 minutes. And I would recommend you do 2 5-minute sessions a day if you can. And in the second session, you don't have to repeat the same activities. You can now do something that's a reinforcement or engagement activity, so a game. And there's lots of games you can play. You can play hangman, you could play word memory. You write down the words, the spelling words for the day or the week on little bits of card. And you would have 2 copies of each word. You turn them face down on the table and you play the memory game. First person, let the child go first. They turn over 2 cards. If they're the same, they need to read the words before they get to keep the 2 cards. If they're different or they didn't read the word correctly, they turn them over and it's your turn. And you keep taking turns until you run out of cards on the table and the person with the most cards wins. Your child is going to want to try hard to win, and that will help their reading a lot. You can do make a word memory, which is similar, but this time we split the words, usually beginning letter endings, and you'll have multiple beginnings and multiple endings so that you can make real words, and there'll be some nonsense words you can make with those combinations. Again, the cards start face down on the table. The child turns over 2 cards. Now, you need to be able to tell which are beginnings and endings of words for this to work, so you would print them on 2 different colours of card or paper. And the child picks up, say, a red and a blue card, looks at them. If they can make a word that is a real word, and they can read the word, they get to keep them. If not, the cards go back down in the pile and you swap those. And you keep going until you've run out of cards. So that's basically it. It's very simple. It should only take between 5 to 15 minutes a day. And I absolutely guarantee that your child will learn how to read and spell and very well. They will be ahead of their reading age before long. What before long means will depend on the child. Please don't think that you're a failure if your child isn't reading by the age of 4 or 5 or whatever the latest whiz bang program has said that their child could do. The natural children will learn very early. There are some kids who are naturals, but they will just start a bit later. Their brain is not ready. The child's brain development is not uniform through all children. What is normal in terms of being able to, when you can pick up reading, is anywhere from the age of 3 to the age of 8. So anywhere in that range will be when your child will be truly ready to learn how to read. And if you happen to pick them at that moment, they will learn to read very quickly. If they're towards the end of that range, it's probably not. You're probably going to try sooner. You're not going to harm them by doing so. If you keep it light and you only do the 5 minutes a day, there'll be no harm done on either side. And the only issue is that the process will take a bit longer than you might like. But it will happen. It might be not as soon as you wish, but sooner than you think. So that's all. If you have any questions or comments, please note them below. And remember, like and subscribe, and you can see more videos.